God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations that are in all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight. Amen. It's challenging to go back home when you're from a small town. There can be a lot of expectation. Sometimes the reviews are mixed. Some people are glad to know that someone from their small town is out there doing well in the bigger world. I'm from Boone, Iowa. We are proud that it was founded by Daniel Boone's very son, Nathaniel. Mamie Dowd Eisenhower was born in Boone, Iowa. We made her modest house into a museum because good things come from Boone, Iowa. So Jesus makes his way. He goes out into the wider world, and people are crammed into the synagogue to hear him. They are amazed that he has become so eloquent, so famous. From Nazareth. Good things can come from Nazareth. Isn't that Joe and Mary's boy? So I got to wonder why Jesus decided to poke the hornet's nest in his hometown. And he says, you will tell me, do in your hometown what we heard you did over in Capernaum. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. What happened? Had Jesus gone to a class reunion the night before and he'd encountered that chasm that can happen when you move away and have some different kinds of experiences? I mean, I get that. I went to seminary in Boston. That was culture shock. I couldn't even understand what people were saying. And they looked at me like this hick from flyover country because I couldn't say Worcester. They thought my accent was funny from Boston. And I thought maybe I made a mistake, but I stuck it out. I found my way. People gradually forgot I was from flyover territory, and I flattened out some of those vowels. But then you go back home, you go to that class reunion, you realize that, wow, you've been living in a different reality. Not everybody's had the same experience of change. Some of the jokes that used to be so funny are now kind of off color. Did we always talk about fags and wetbacks when I was in high school? Where did that come from? And if you dare to say something about, well, that wasn't funny. Oh, well, you've been to Boston, you've been to seminary, you've learned all these big words like exegesis. So you think you know better than us, and you're going to tell us how to think and what to do. And that's the thing, is sometimes we move into new situations, we have to grow and adapt, but it creates a cognitive dissonance with our past. And, we don't really ever get through that. We learn to live with it. On the one hand, my bedrock values, they are Iowa through and through. Hard work, respect, community, very Iowa for me. Much like here, probably. And on the other hand, I've had to adapt and change. I've met different kinds of people, and change can happen in this world as fast as lightning strikes. And sometimes doing well with adapting to the world causes conflict back home and with the people we love. And how do we deal with that? So here's Jesus, and something has lit in a fire of indignation. And he has to speak. And notice in the text, there's a turning point from it says, all spoke well of him, and within 2 verses, everybody's furious at him. So what did he say? What was the turning point? So he notices, he tells 2 stories of healing from the great prophets Elijah and Elisha. They performed acts of healing, and these were for a woman who was from Sidon and the general Naaman, who was from Syria and had leprosy. Now, those stories are in the Bible. Why do people get so angry that he reminded them of these stories? Well, the context is Israel had conflict with both Sidon and Syria. Sidon was Canaanite territory. Remember the Canaanites from the Old Testament? They worshiped Baal. They were told to have human sacrifices. They were seen as the enemy. They were in conflict with them. Remember the infamous Jezebel? She was from Sidon. Conflict has simmered between Israel and Syria down to the present time. Centuries before Jesus, they had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. So there was always that kind of tension. So why is Jesus emphasizing mercy for a widow from Sidon and a leper from Assyria? What next, Jesus? You're going to ask us to love our enemies? Which is the passage 3 weeks from now. The story they know about the Messiah is that the Messiah is supposed to liberate them and restore the kingdom of Israel. And Jesus is modifying the story to a story of healing and love that crossed boundaries. So the hometown crowd, they're ready to throw Jesus off the cliff. Now, he could have come home and said, hey folks, love your neighbor, who's sick, I'll heal a few folks, and gone back to Capernaum and not had any trouble. But he had to go there. Now, I've heard that people can get upset when you get into conflictual social issues from the pulpit. I don't know, I've heard that. Is that true? We even had maybe a modern day reenactment of this not long ago at the National Cathedral, as Bishop Buddy called for mercy for immigrants, for LGBTQ people, for others who are afraid of persecution. And now half the country thinks she's a saint and half thinks she should resign and maybe throw her over a cliff. So I'd like to look at her words not from a political point of view, not from which side it justifies, but there's a context. You see, Bishop Buddy, she's a bishop, right? You don't just get appointed to be a bishop because you gave a lot of money. You got to work your way up in ministry and service to the church. And nearly all denominations have statements on immigration dating back decades. And to have a denominational statement on immigration, well, there has to be a lot of committees and a lot of debate and a lot of revisions, and you finally get it to a general synod, and everybody has to vote on it, often by a huge majority, for it to finally pass, and everybody's happy with it. So these are carefully worked out and argumented documents. And therefore, then they contain the theology, the mission of what it means to be a church and be faithful on a particular issue. So this week I read denominational statements on immigration I picked a wide diversity: Episcopal, Roman Catholic, Southern Baptist, Lutheran, and United Church of Christ. Pretty big spectrum, right, of what you would expect from this group of churches. Well, they all agree that it's a very complicated issue. But each points that churches have a unique role to play in our national social issues. Did you know that church agencies are the largest nonprofit in the United States that resettle immigrants and refugees? 70% of all refugees who are resettled by churches and church-supported agencies. 70%. Financial support for immigration services is our highest domestic expenditure for humanitarian relief for churches. So when a denominational leader speaks out on these issues, they're speaking for the front lines of people who are finding housing and jobs and teaching English as a second language and supporting humanitarian relief and meeting the legal challenges. So I looked at these various statements. Southern Baptists have a lot of immigration ministries. Many Southern Baptist churches teach ESL. They have immigrants as their members. And recently, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptists emphasized that we must balance compassion with respect for the rule of law. They also said they didn't want ICE agents in their churches and in their programs. To quote, "The president is right to fix our broken immigration system, but must not turn churches into wards of the state, or pastors to ask for documents for people who are coming through our doors. This would turn away many law-abiding immigrants who would be fearful to attend our churches." I read through what the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans and the Episcopalians and the United Church of Christ had to say. Every denomination calls for comprehensive immigration reform, to fix a broken system, to address root causes of the problem. They support family unity, a clear path to citizenship, respect for human rights for everyone. I could not find a single denomination in all of the United States that supports mass deportation. Not one. And my point is, Bishop Budde spoke for her church. She spoke for the majority of denominations in this country. And I want you to hear the first line of the Episcopal Church Government Affairs Office on immigration. The Episcopal Church champions and advocates for humane policy towards migrants because of our belief that every human being is a child of God and must be treated with dignity. It focuses on values. These values have come in conflict with the last 4 presidential administrations, regardless of party. The Episcopal Church and others joined lawsuits against the Obama administration over immigration policy. All leaders have blind spots. And regardless of party, it is our role to speak truth to power if it conflicts with our values. So we go back to Nazareth. And Jesus is there, and he's speaking a truth that he knows people may not want to hear. He models for us to have the courage of our convictions, but we really have to take care of how we do this. We can't just go off and start condemning people who might not agree with us. Stay off Facebook. Nothing's ever been settled in a Facebook argument that I know of. And later this month, love your enemies is going to be the passage that we're going to wrestle with. The style is so important. To stick to those central themes of the Christian faith: mercy, love, human dignity. It's so important that we stay to the central themes of our Christian story and not wander too far afield and into the weeds and of condemnation. And this became really clear to me. I've just finished reading Yuval Harari's book called *Sapiens*. And it's kind of a history of the human race. And one of the things he struggles with is, how did we go from hunter-gatherer societies with about 100 to 120 people wandering around as nomads to actually having cities and civilizations? What is it that made that link, that we moved beyond that kind of stage of living? And he said we couldn't do it until we had stories. You see, you have to have a common story to have a civilization that gives us shared values and understandings and purpose. And that story might be a religion or a spirituality. It might be about the divine right of kings or having a constitutional government. But it has to be a story that brings people together. If there's no story, there's no trust. You see, it's stories that create peace. It's stories that allow us to trade with each other, that allow us to engage in common problem solving of complicated challenges. It's stories that give us the ability to tolerate a diversity of peoples and still hold together. With no common story, there's no trust. When the dominant narrative becomes about who to blame, or it starts to dehumanize people who may be different in some way, well, then cooperation falls apart. Problem solving grinds to a halt, and our resources are going to go into conflict and violence rather than human progress. Nothing is more important than the quest to tell stories that can bring us together, that can help us see each other and work together. Jesus knew that telling a better story, one of mercy and inclusion and of love, might not be what everybody wanted to hear sometimes, but he told it. He made that choice. And sometimes we have to wrestle with these choices too. Will we tell a story that's worth living? Will we speak a truth that heals, even if it might not be so popular right now? Our faith stories emphasize God's love for all of humanity. God challenges us to love even people who are hard to love because we were first loved. And we get fearful, we get frustrated, we get anxious, we lose the thread of what the story should be. And I find as a writer, it's hard to tell a good story. There's always that inner critic inside. Says, that's not the right word. People might not like that. Or your story just isn't all that important. Maybe it doesn't matter. And to get through that and to tell the story, I always ask myself, what is this story about? Have I told a story worth hearing? Have I told a story that's worth living? And if not, edit. Keep working at it. Refine it until it's worth sharing. Friends, you are all the living embodiment of God's great story of love. The life you live may be the only Bible that some people are going to read. So tell the story well. Tell it with all your heart. Amen.